Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons and welcome to the very last video lecture of the semester. So in this video lecture we're going to go into chapter 20 which is getting into community ecology and ecosystem ecology. So we're going to be talking about communities and ecosystems such as this coral reef that you see right here. Okay, so first I want to make clear what a community is and what an ecosystem is. So you already learned about what a population is. So that is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area. So a community goes one step further. So that's all the living things of all the different species that are in a given area. So for instance, what you see here is a coral reef community, right? So we see different types of fishes, different types of corals, different types of algae and sponges, right? So you have all these different living things that are all in the same area. So that is a community. An ecosystem then goes one step even beyond that. So an ecosystem includes all the living things in an area of all those different species, but it also includes all the non-living things in that area. So for instance, underneath all of this coral are the old skeletal remains of corals that came before these ones. So all of those non-living skeletons of those corals underneath, those would also be included in this ecosystem. So a coral reef ecosystem includes all these living things that you see up here, plus the skeletons of corals that are underneath, as well as like things like sand and like the water that's around them. So communities include all the living things in an area of all different species, whereas ecosystems include those living things plus the non-living things. Okay, so a lot of what we're going to talk about here is biodiversity. Because we're going to talk about community ecology and ecosystem ecology. And so a really big aspect of all of those is how many living things or how many different types of living things are there in that area, right? So what biodiversity describes is the variety of living things. Is there just one or two living things in that area, or are there many, many, many different types of living things in that area? In kind of a typical metric of biodiversity is just the number of species that are in an area. This is often referred to as species richness, right? So is there 3 species there, or are there thousands of species there? Okay, and so is it important? So biodiversity is definitely important. So for instance, some of the most diverse ecosystems, such as rainforests and coral reefs, are some of the ones that are the most important to us, right? So we get a lot of really important things from rainforests and coral reefs. And so biodiversity in general is a very, very important aspect of life on this planet. The more biodiverse an area is, in general, the more services that area provides to both the living things in that area and to the humans that are in that area. So biodiversity is definitely a good thing. And there's just pictures of those two very diverse ecosystems, so coral reefs and rainforests. Okay, so let's see if you can figure this out here. So when we look at these two different woodlands, right, which of these do you think has the most species diversity, right? So which one is the most speciose? So most of you while looking at these two pictures would pick woodland B. You would say, okay, woodland B looks like it's more diverse. It looks like there's more of a variety of things that are living there. However, it's important to note that a lot of why you did that is because you're looking at the number of species and the relative abundance of the species in that area. So if you actually count the different types of trees in this picture on the top, in this picture on the bottom, it actually has the same number of trees, right? So we have this spruce tree, we have this, I don't know, maple tree, we have this fir tree, and we have this, I don't know, pine tree. So we have 4 different trees here. And you find actually the same number of trees in this woodland down here. However, what you see is that in the top, it's mostly dominated by these maple trees, by these kind of lollipop-shaped trees. Whereas down here, there's more kind of an even mix of different types of trees. So in general, when we think of species diversity, we are thinking not only about the number of species in that area, but also the abundance of each of those areas. So if two areas have the same number of species, but one area is very much dominated by one species, then we tend to think of that area that's dominated by one as being less species diverse. Okay, so that's kind of how in general ecologists measure species diversity. Okay, so what we're going to talk about for most of the remainder of this chapter is interactions between different species, because that is really the thrust of community ecology, right? Because communities, as we just learned, are all the different living things, different species of living things in an area. So community ecology, a lot of what it focuses on is the interactions between those different species, right? Because we learned that ecology is the study of interactions between organisms in the environment around them. So if we're talking about community ecology, we're going to be talking about interactions between different species. And how these interactions are oftentimes plotted is in a chart such as this. So consider, for instance, we have species A and we have species B. And there are different outcomes for what can happen when species A and species B interact with each other. So for instance, that interaction can be good for species A, or it can be bad for species A. Also, it can be good for species B or bad for species B. So up in this first box up here, we have an interaction that is good for species A, and it's good for species B. So this is what is generally referred to as mutualism. It's an interaction that is mutually beneficial to the two species that are engaging in that interaction. So any sort of interaction where both of the species benefit from it, that is a mutualism. So for instance, in the first of the ecology chapters, I talked all about Alpheid shrimp and goby fishes, where the shrimp and the goby benefit each other. The shrimp provides a benefit to the goby fish by making a little hole in the sand that the two of them can hide inside of from predators, and the goby fish provides a benefit to the shrimp by being a little lookout for the shrimp and telling the shrimp when it's safe to come outside of the burrow, because those shrimps are blind and they can't see predators that are outside of the burrow. So that's beneficial to both of them. Okay, there's a couple of different interactions that are good for one species and bad for the other. And these, in general, have to do with eating things, right? Because in general, if you are eating something, it's good for you to be able to eat, to be able to get energy from your food, but it really sucks to be the thing to get eaten. So there's predation, there's herbivory, there's parasitism, right? These are all interactions that are good for one species and bad for the other. Right, so in the last chapter we talked about snowshoe hares and lynxes, right? So that was the large cat in the small rabbit-like thing, and so that's obviously good for the lynx, bad for the snowshoe hare, and so that's predation, an animal eating another animal. There is also herbivory, right? So an animal eating a plant, and then there's parasitism, and so where parasitism is kind of different from the others is that parasites tend to be smaller than the things that they eat, whereas predators tend to be larger than the things they eat, right? So a snowshoe hare is smaller than the lynx that eats it, right? So the lynx, the predator, is bigger than the prey. But in the case of a parasite, say like a tapeworm, right? A tapeworm is smaller than the human that it lives inside of. So parasites are smaller and they either live on top of or inside of the things that they parasitize. Whereas predators are larger than the things that they eat and they don't live on top of the things that they eat. Okay, and then finally there are interactions that are bad for species A and bad for species B. This is what we call competition, right? And so we talked a bit about this in the last chapter, right? So corals and algae, they fight with each other for space on the seafloor, for instance, right? So that is bad for both of them. Okay, and you might be wondering what's going on in this empty box here, right? So that is essentially just the same as this box down here, right? So this box would be bad for species A and bad for species B, whereas this box is good for species A, bad for species B, right? So they're just inverse of each other. There's not another set of interactions that go in there. So what we'll do is we'll kind of go into a little bit more detail about each of those types of interactions. Right, so first we'll talk a little bit more about mutualism and species that benefit each other. And mutualisms are really some of the most important interactions on the planet because there are a lot of things that just wouldn't be able to exist if it wasn't for mutualism. So a really good example of this is pollination, right? So a huge number of the angiosperms that are on the planet, so a huge number of those flowering plants that are on the planet rely on pollinators in order to reproduce. So pollinators such as this hummingbird, right? So the hummingbird goes in to eat some nectar out of this plant, and what it does is it inadvertently gets some pollen from this flower, on its little beak, and that pollen contains DNA of this flower. The hummingbird then goes to another plant, and then it pollinates that other plant by bringing the DNA to that other plant. Right, so that's how those flowers reproduce with the help of this pollinator of the hummingbird. So this is good for both of them. The bird gets a snack, and the flower gets to reproduce. And a huge amount of the things that we consume actually are pollinated, right? So most of the fruits that you consume are pollinated in this way, either by birds or by bees that do the pollinating. Okay, another one that we've talked about before is corals and dinoflagellates. Right, so the coral is the larger animal-like thing here, and a dinoflagellate is a small a protist, a small phytoplankton. And what they trade is that the coral provides a home for the small dinoflagellates that live inside of it, and the dinoflagellates in return photosynthesize because they are photosynthetic protists. So they produce sugars using energy from the sun, and they give a lot of those sugars to the corals that they live inside of. So they're trading shelter for sugars. So again, that's very beneficial to both of them. And it's actually one of maybe the most important mutualism that is in the ocean. Because roughly 25% of all of the things all the living things found in the ocean are found in coral reefs. So without this interaction between dinoflagellates and corals, there'd be a huge number of things that are in the ocean right now that just wouldn't exist if this interaction just didn't occur. So a very, very important interaction. We talked a little bit about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi back when we were in the fungi chapter, right? So the fungi, they're really good at getting nutrients out of the soil, and they're these kind of like globby looking things. So they get nutrients out of the soil and they give it to the plant through the plant's root, which is what this thing is here. And then plants, of course, photosynthesize, so they provide sugars to their little fungi friends. Finally, one last mutualism I wanted to mention really briefly is cleaning mutualism. So that's where a smaller organism goes onto the surface or into the mouth of a larger organism and cleans the parasites out of it. So what you see here, this small fish is what's known as a cleaning goby, and this larger fish is what's known as a grouper. So this small goby will actually go inside of the mouth of this grouper, and you can tell by the teeth of it that this is a predatory grouper. This grouper will eat other fishes, but it won't eat this small cleaning goby because the cleaning goby is providing a service to it. It's removing parasites from the mouth of this larger grouper. And in return, the small goby gets a snack. It gets to eat those parasites. So that's what's known as cleaning mutualism. Okay, let's talk a little bit about predation and about herbivory. Right, so predation is predators eating prey. And so let's think about what are the sort of things that predators must do in order to get their prey, right? So they have to, first just be able to come in physical contact with them. And so there's a bunch of strategies that they use for that. And then, of course, they have to have anatomy that allows them to get, in order to eat those prey, right? So a lot of the things that predators have is they have, sharp teeth. They tend to be quick. Sometimes they're really cryptic, meaning that they blend in really well, right? So in particular, predators that are known as ambush predators, things that kind of hide in plain sight, but that kind of blend in with their environment. They will just wait for prey to come by, prey that don't see that they're there. And a lot of predators will have very, very keen senses. I think there's no better example of that than sharks, right? So sharks have a really, really keen sense of smell. They have these senses for picking up vibrations that are in the water around them. In fact, all fishes are able to do that. And sharks are able to also pick up on electrical pulses that are in the water, right? So when you go in the water, or when any vertebrate with a heart goes in the water, the act of your heart beating makes a small amount of electricity, and so it produces a small electrical field around you, and so sharks can actually sense that electrical field. Right, so even if you went in the water and didn't move at all, stayed perfectly still, and didn't have any smell, a shark could actually sense that you were there, just by the beating of your heart. So it's actually a really good thing that in general sharks don't think that we are tasty, because sharks, have very, very keen senses, but in fact sharks attack humans very, very rarely. Only something like roughly 10 humans die, from shark attacks per year. So way, way fewer than other, ways that humans, pass away from health problems or car accidents or gun violence or whatever. So those are sharks. So the prey, they have a lot of similar adaptations, right? So it's good to be quick, good to be cryptic, like blending in. Having keen senses for telling where those predators are is really important. Having friends is really important to prey, because there's safety in numbers, and there's two reasons why having friends around you confers some safety. So the one reason why it's useful to have friends around you, is that if you're in a big school or a big herd of individuals, it's harder for a predator to cue in and attack any one of those individual prey. So there's that kind of advantage. It's harder to select which one to eat. So you can kind of think of that as like, say you go to a restaurant and the restaurant has a huge, huge menu with just tons and tons of options. It's harder to decide which thing to go after and eat when there's so many to choose from. Another reason that being in a herd or a school offers an advantage, has to do with really kind of just the odds of getting eaten. So if you think about it, so say you and your friends, go for a hike in the woods, and you come across a hungry mountain lion, right? So if you were to encounter that mountain lion on your own, in order to get away from it, you need to be able to run faster than that mountain lion. But if you are in a group of friends, all you have to do is run faster than your slowest friend to get away from that mountain lion. Because if you have a slow friend amongst you, then that means that your slow friend is going to be the one that gets eaten and you're going to get away. So there's a really important lesson there. Anytime you go out hiking, you should make sure that you have a slower friend than you, so that if you get attacked by a mountain lion, you can make sure that it's your friend that gets eaten and not you. Obviously, I'm kidding. You're very unlikely to get attacked by a mountain lion. I think maybe even fewer people get attacked by mountain lions than sharks. It's very unlikely to happen. But having friends, is good for that purpose. Finally, a lot of prey have toxins in them. So it's good to, if you can't, hide from predators and you're not faster than them, if you have toxins or poisons inside of you, then a predator is not going to want to eat you because it's very, very unpleasant. Finally, a lot of prey will, when they have toxins inside of them, they will have coloration that indicates to a predator that they are not tasty. Uh, so kind of the idea behind this, is that if you have really, really bad toxins inside of you, that a predator doesn't want to eat, the idea is that you want to be really bright and flashy, so that you advertise yourself to those predators, and the predator can very easily, see you and see, oh, that's one of those things that I ate before that tasted really badly. I don't want to eat that. So in fact, when you have toxins inside of you, it's almost better to be colorful so that predators know that you're one of those untasty things. But then kind of an interesting thing occurs with a lot of different animals and plants for that matter, where if there is something that has a toxin or a venom or a poison inside of it, then oftentimes other things will mimic those things, and they will be given some advantage. So for instance, these are two types of snakes. And this snake on the right has warning coloration, right? So this is a venomous snake. You do not want to get bitten by this snake. Whereas this snake over here on the left is completely harmless. So it has, it certainly has teeth, but it doesn't have venom inside of it. And so this snake on the left is a mimic, right? So it is mimicking the coloration of this other snake that is harmful. So when a predator sees this snake, it gets tricked, right? So the predator sees this snake and says, oh, that's one of those things that has toxins in it. I don't want to mess with that. But in fact, this snake is very, very harmless. And you might have even heard that there's a rhyme to tell these two snakes apart. Uh, it's something like red touches black, you're okay, Jack. Red touches yellow, you're a dead fellow. Right? So if red and yellow are touching each other, then that means that's a poisonous snake. Whereas if red is touching black, then that is a snake that is not harmful. A better way to remember that is just to not remember it all and just don't pick up snakes when you're in the woods. That's just not a good idea because it's very easy to get that rhyme confused. So anyway, so that's warning coloration and mimicry. Okay, one more aspect of predators that I want to talk about is the idea of keystone predators. And so what keystone predators do is that they have a very large effect on the communities in which they live. They have an effect that is much larger than you would expect them to have, given how abundant they are in their ecosystem. And in general, how keystone predators have that large effect is by controlling whatever the dominant competitor is in that particular area. So what you see here is a type of sea star known as Pisaster acraceus, or the common name for this is the ochre sea star. So this is a sea star that you find, all along the west coast of the United States, from in up into Canada. So from California all the way up into Canada and up into Alaska, you can find this sea star. And sea stars such as this one are predators. And this sea star specializes in eating mussels, right? So mussels are these dark things that you see underneath them, right? So mussels are types of mollusks, right? So those were those things that you learned about that sometimes have shells, they have a foot, they have a visceral mass, and they have a mantle. And so mussels are a type of mollusk that are bivalves, meaning that they have two shells that holds all their important bits on the inside. So sea stars are really well adapted for prying open the mussels, right? So they're good at yanking those mussels open and eating the soft parts on the inside of the mussel. And a really famous community ecologist by the name of Robert Payne, he did a really simple but a really interesting experiment back in the 1960s. So what he did was he took these sea stars, and in one area he completely removed them from that place. And what he found was that when you do that, the area becomes dominated by mussels, because mussels are competitively dominant in those rocky intertidal areas in which they live. So when the sea star goes away, the mussels start to dominate. However, when the sea stars are in place, what they do is they keep the mussel numbers to a lower abundance. And what that does is it allows other things to come in and take up that space on the seafloor. Because what mussels and other things compete for is space on the seafloor to grow. So various types of seaweeds and barnacles can then grow on the seafloor when sea stars come along and remove the mussels from that area. So what keystone predators do is they have a really big effect by controlling the dominant competitor in that area, right? So these sea stars control just how abundant the mussels are, and that gives barnacles and algae and seaweeds, a fighting chance of being able to occur in that particular area. And so why Robert Payne referred to these sea stars as keystone predators has to do with archaeological architecture. So ancient Romans, they discovered this idea of having a keystone rock. And what a keystone rock is it's at the very top of a column, or an archway, I should say. And a keystone rock is shaped like a trapezoid rather than a perfect square. And what that rock does is it allows the whole archway to stand up. So all of Roman, ancient Roman architecture is based on that, on arches that have keystone rocks at the top of them. And so that rock holds the whole arch in place, and consequently it holds up, something like the Roman Colosseum in place, as does this sea star kind of keeps this ecosystem, keeps this community in check by controlling the mussels in that area. Okay, so then we have herbivory. So that's, another type of interaction that is bad for I'm sorry, it's good for one species, bad for the other. So herbivory is, of course, animals eating plants. And so herbivores, they have a different set of adaptations from those of predators. When you look at the teeth of a herbivore, it tends to be very different from the teeth of a predator, right? So you can see here, this is the teeth of a deer, I guess this is. And you can see that their teeth are kind of flat and more kind of built for grinding up plant matter than for tearing, bits of flesh off of an animal. And probably the most important adaptation that herbivores have is a digestive tract that is really good at dissolving plant matter, right? So plants are very fibery, right? So they have a lot of cellulose in their cell walls that make them very, very fibery, which actually makes it very hard to dissolve. It's hard for your stomach to break up that stuff. So that's why herbivores tend to have a very sophisticated digestive tract, and they tend to have a very long digestive tract, right? So the longer a digestive tract, the more time the food spends in that tract, and the longer time it has to dissolve and break apart. So the digestive tracts of herbivores, things like cows, tend to be much longer than the digestive tracts of things like wolves, like predators, because it's just way easier to break down animal flesh than it is to break down plant matter. Plants, of course, have some adaptations for this as well, for this interaction. But unlike animals that can run away from predators, plants obviously can't do that. So they have kind of a different set of ways of dealing with this, right? So a lot of plants are really spiny. A lot of them have thorns. A lot of them are very, very chewy. And a lot of them have toxins in them. And a lot of those toxins actually are used for human purposes. So things like morphine and nicotine and peppermint and cinnamon and a lot of other different types of spices are actually toxins that plants use to keep themselves from getting eaten by herbivores. It's just that, humans, we have found that you can use these things in small doses for, either medicinal or cuisine type uses. So peppermint and cinnamon they're actually toxins that plants use to defend themselves. Okay, so then there are parasites or pathogens, right? And so as I was saying before, these are things that live on the surface of a host or inside of that host. And there are things that they get their nourishment from those larger animals that they live inside of. The difference between parasites and pathogens is that pathogens cause disease. So for instance, like the bacteria Borrelia, it's a pathogen because it causes Lyme disease. Whereas something like a tapeworm is a parasite because it doesn't necessarily cause a disease, but it does live inside of its host. And this is probably my favorite example of a parasite. So this thing that you see right here, this is a type of crustacean. So it's a type of arthropod. This thing is what is technically known as an isopod. And what this particular isopod does is it gets inside of the mouth of a fish, right? So that's what you're looking at here. This is a fish. And what this isopod does is it eats the tongue of the fish, and then it uses that space where the tongue used to be, and it lives there in the mouth of the fish, and it kind of takes the place of the tongue. And any time this fish then goes to eat something, the parasite that's there basically gets first dibs at that food because it can eat some of that food that the larger fish has eaten. So it kind of sits there and steals the food from the fish, right? So pretty disgusting parasite. If you're ever, at the beach and you see one of these things swimming towards your mouth, you close your mouth very tightly because you don't want one of these eating your tongue and then taking the place of your tongue. Obviously, I kid. These things don't get inside of the mouths of humans and become our tongue. We have one advantage over fish in that we have hands. So if something like that was able to get into your mouth, then of course you could brush your teeth and get rid of it. But obviously fish don't have toothbrushes. Okay, we're not going to talk about interactions between competitors because we kind of already discussed that in the last chapter. But what I do want to do is talk a little bit about invasive species. Because a lot of our knowledge of invasive species has kind of helped out our understanding of community ecology. Because if you think about it, invasive species oftentimes offer a kind of natural experiment in community ecology. You know, say an invasive species that is a predator comes into an area. You can kind of look at the effect of predators on prey by studying that invasive species. So it provides sort of a natural experiment for studying community ecology. So of course, invasive species are things that are from one area, but then us humans bring them to a new area. And that's either on purpose or by accident. You know, we live in a very globalized world where humans are moving around and goods are being transported all over the world. You know, so there's a lot of vectors now for invasive species to get moved around. And then what sets apart invasive species from what are oftentimes called like exotic species is that invasive species have a really major effect. So an exotic species is just anything that gets transported to a place where it doesn't belong. But when we then call it invasive is then when that exotic species starts having a negative effect, right? Starts having damaging effects on the communities and the ecosystems and the economies of that local area. So that's what an invasive species is, something that doesn't belong in that area that is having very negative effects on that particular area. Right, and so there's some really, you know, there's lots and lots of examples of invasive species. Because as I've said, we now live in a very global world where things are getting moved around a lot. So some of the, you know, some pretty notorious ones are things like lionfish, which we've talked about and we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. Burmese pythons, that's another invasive species. So there are now lots of these pythons throughout the Everglades in Florida. These are pythons that are, you know, more used to being in Southeast Asia, but people have them as pets, and pythons and other snakes are really good at escaping from their terrariums. And so now there are these Burmese pythons all over the Everglades eating alligators and eating people's small dogs and cats and raccoons and having all sorts of bad problems. And plants can also be invasive. You know, we have this is what's known as kudzu, which is an invasive vine that is found in Hawaii and also in the southeast of the United States. And the problems that it causes is that it covers over other plants and smothers and kills it. It'll also cover school buses and school children, you know, and smother and murder those poor little children. Obviously, I'm kidding again. But they are very damaging in that they harm a lot of plants in the areas where they invade. Of course, we have some we have some invasive species, or at least exotic species in Los Angeles too. Probably a lot of you have seen parrots around. You know, so if you go out, you know, if you go out in your neighborhood, you know, anytime from say 6:30 to 8, the really loud, very screechy bird that you're hearing is most likely a parrot. Right, so parrots are very active in the early morning and the late afternoon, and they are super loud. And from what I understand, I don't think anybody has looked at whether or not they have a super negative effect, you know, on these local areas. But they are certainly not supposed to be in Los Angeles. They're more supposed to be in Central and South America. Right, so we have those parrots in Los Angeles, and we have lots and lots of different plants that don't belong here. In fact, if you're just to go outside and walk around your neighborhood, most of the trees and plants that you would see around you really don't belong, you know, in the valley. In general, the types of plants that are native to the valley are not that diverse, because it's a very dry area that never really supported a tremendous amount of plant life. So there's really not that many native plants to the valley. Most of the plants that you see don't really belong here, including, the plant that Los Angeles is really known for, palm trees. Palm trees are not native to Los Angeles, right? There were never native palm trees in Los Angeles. You'd have to go over more to the Joshua Tree area to find where palm trees were actually native to. Okay, so invasive species do have pretty major effects, especially this particular invasive species here. So this invasive species not only has a lot of damaging effects on the communities and the ecosystems that it's in, but it also costs a huge amount of money, right? So this is what's known as a zebra mussel, and they cost, many, many billions of dollars per year to manage. So in the United States in general, invasive species, at least when I looked this up recently, cost something like $120 billion per year to manage. And a lot of that $120 billion is coming from this thing right here, these zebra mussels. Right, so zebra mussels got into the United States in the Great Lakes area. And from there, they spread throughout all of the waterways connected to the Great Lakes, which is pretty much most of the east of the United States. And they've popped up in various areas, in the west as well, including, places in Southern California and in the Colorado River. So how zebra mussels got to the United States is through bilge water, or I should say ballast water. And so what ballast water is when a big ship is out on the open ocean, what it will do is if that ship doesn't have a lot of cargo on it, it will take in a bunch of water, and that water makes the boat heavier. And that effect of the boat being heavier makes it sink, like not all the way to the sea floor, but it will sink down a little bit lower. So essentially, more of the boat is below sea level. And what that does is it increases stability of the boat. So as that boat goes over, through waves and through storms, it's less likely to sink than if it didn't take in that ballast water. So unfortunately, what happened a lot, and not as much anymore, but what used to happen a lot, is that a boat would go to some place in, say, Southeast Asia, and suck up a bunch of ballast water, go across the Pacific Ocean to some place like the Great Lakes, and then once it's in the Great Lakes, it doesn't need that ballast water anymore because the lakes are relatively calm, and it would dump all that ballast water into the Great Lakes. But now any of the living things that were in that water that it sucked up in Southeast Asia has now been dumped into the lakes in this area. So ballast water was a really major issue, and it was an issue that nobody really had thought about until zebra mussels, uh, got their way into the United States and started having these really big problems. And the exact problems that they cause is that they clog up any sort of pipes that are taking in water. So along all of these waterways here, there's lots of just different types of manufacturing and different factories that are along these waterways. And a lot of times what they do is they're taking in that water either for agriculture, or they're taking in that water as part of the manufacturing process. But so now what happens is that zebra mussels will clog up these pipes on a very, very regular basis because they grow so quickly. So what has now happened is that all these pipes have to be cleaned on a very regular basis, and that costs a lot of money to do. So that's why zebra mussels are such damaging invasive species. Okay, so in the first of the ecology chapters, chapter 18, we talked a lot about life history traits, right? So those are things such as the number of offspring that you produce, and how quickly it takes for you to get into reproductive stages, and how much parental care you give. So with invasive species in general, they tend to be things that grow very quickly. They tend to be things that produce a lot of offspring. They tend to be things that when they do produce offspring, they do it really, really frequently. So it tends to be things more like fish and crabs rather than things like whales or sharks. So this is of course generalities. There are exceptions to this rule. But when we think about a lot of invasive species, they do tend to be more things like zebra mussels that reproduce very quickly, grow very fast. They get to a reproductive age very, very young in life. So they tend to be a lot of things like that. However, there are exceptions, things like Burmese pythons, that take a long time to get to be reproductive. They don't have a huge amount of offspring. So there are exceptions to the rule like those pythons. And then, of course, there are lots of effects that invasive species can have on the communities they invade, right? So if we think about the ways that different species interact with each other, right? So we talked about mutualism, we talked about predation, we talked about competition, we talked about herbivory, we talked about parasitism, right? So some of the negative effects that invasive species have includes those things that we just talked about, right? So sometimes invasive species will be predators and they'll start to eat the things in an area. Sometimes invasive species will come in and they'll start to compete with other things that are in that area. Sometimes invasive species will be parasites and they'll come in and they'll start to parasitize things in that area. So invasive species can have, negative effects on things in that community through the kind of normal channels that species interact with each other. And so, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about lionfish because, as you know, I'm pretty obsessed with them. So lionfish, as I think we talked about before, and so I'll kind of go through this quickly. They're native to the Indo-Pacific, but through the aquarium trade, through private aquaria, they got into Florida and then spread throughout the tropical parts of the Western Atlantic, right? So the tropical parts or the warm parts of the U.S. Eastern Seaboard, Gulf of Mexico, northern parts of Central America and South America, and throughout the Caribbean. And the effects that they have has to do with the fact that they are so lionfish have kind of two really good things that are going for them. So first of all, they're defended with venomous spines, right? So the spines on the top right here, and then a couple that you see that are there have venom in them, and they're very painful. I know quite a few people that have been stung by lionfish, and it's really a very, very unpleasant thing. So you can imagine if a human might get stung by one of these, it's very easy for a predator trying to eat this lionfish for them to get stung as well. So they have that going for them. Another thing that they have going for them is that they have an appearance and a behavior that doesn't seem to be recognized by small fishes. So they really don't look a lot like other predators in the Atlantic, right? This is what the business end of a lionfish looks like. This is what the business end of a typical predator in the Caribbean or the tropical Atlantic looks like, right? They really don't look that much alike to each other. So it seems like a lot of what is going on is that small fishes, see this lionfish and they don't even know that it's something that is dangerous to them. And then on top of that, lionfish have some unique behaviors, right? So in the very first lecture, we talked about how they blow jets of water at their prey, right? That's a unique behavior, right? There's no other fish that we know of that are in the Atlantic that carry out that behavior. And so lionfish have effects on the communities around them by eating things. So this is one lionfish that looks like about 11 inches long, and all of these fish in this large fish in this shrimp were inside of the stomach of that lionfish, right? So you can see that they have a really major effect by eating things. And one of the first really good studies to show this effect was done by my friend Mark. And what he did was he set up reefs that had lionfish and reefs that didn't have lionfish. So you remember from the last chapter, I talked about the research that my wife Casey did, where she set up reefs that have lionfish in them in different densities, right? So on one reef, she put one lionfish, on one she put two, on one she put eight, on one she put 12. And I talked about how when you put a fish on a reef, it will tend to stay on that reef. It doesn't go too far because it doesn't want to go through really open, vulnerable areas to get to another reef. So Mark did a very similar study to the one that my wife Casey did. And what he did was he set up reefs such that some had a lionfish on them and some had no lionfish on them. And then he just looked at the number of baby fish that were showing up on that reef. So he did this experiment in the summertime in this area in the Bahamas. During the summertime in the Bahamas, you have lots of new baby fish showing up to the reef. You can think of it as like new baby fish being born onto that reef. And on reefs that you have a lionfish, you see very few new babies because the lionfish are eating all of them. Whereas on reefs without lionfish, you see an accumulation of more and more of those baby fish coming along because there's more birth essentially. There's more baby fish showing up. So those lionfish have a very negative effect simply by eating those juvenile fish that are showing up. But there's kind of another reason why people are kind of more scared of the effect that lionfish have, because they could have effects on the entire reef, not just on the things that they're eating. So this kind of relates to a topic that I want to talk about known as trophic structure in kind of food webs. So we talked about this a little bit in the context of kelp forests. So you may remember that there's an herbivore that likes to eat kelp. That herbivore are urchins. And then there's an animal that likes to eat those urchins, and that's a sea otter. Right? So sea otters eat urchins and urchins eat kelp. So if you have a lot of sea otters in an area, that controls the abundance of the urchins and makes it such that the kelp can survive in that area. So that's kind of what's known as trophic structure, where one level on a food web, what's typically referred to as a trophic level, can have effects on the other levels in the food web. And those effects can either be by eating things or or just by being there, by being something that other things eat. So what you see on coral reefs is you have fish like lionfish that are what are known as secondary consumers. They consume, you guessed it, primary consumers, right? So these are herbivorous fishes. So if you're herbivorous, that means you're eating plants, you're eating algae. Algae are what are known as producers because they are actually taking the sunlight and producing sugars from it. And then those primary consumers come along that eat the producers, and then secondary consumers come along and eat the primary consumers. And so we learned before that algae compete for space with corals on the sea floor. And now corals are very, very important to coral reef ecosystems because corals are what are known as ecosystem engineers. Right, so a lot of you, will know that an engineer is a person that designs and builds something. Corals build that ecosystem. The skeletons that corals produce become the foundation for that whole ecosystem. And then everything grows on top of those coral skeletons. So corals are very, very important in in coral reef areas, which is why we really want to have more corals and less algae on coral reefs, because it's the corals that are necessary for that ecosystem to be there. We don't need, those algae to be there. So to reiterate, lionfish, eat herbivorous fish eat algae, and algae compete with corals for space. So kind of the worry is that you could have a really harmful trophic cascade, where what happens at one level affects things at the bottom indirectly. So the concern is that lionfish could reduce the abundance of herbivores by eating them. And if those herbivores are not very abundant, then that is going to cause the algae to increase in abundance because there's nothing to eat them. Those algae can then outcompete the corals for space because there's nothing controlling them. It's kind of like we talked about with the sea otters and urchins and kelp, right? When you have sea otters, they can control the urchins. And so if the urchins are kept at small numbers, then the kelp can thrive. In this case, if lionfish keep herbivores at too low a number, then these algae can thrive and outcompete corals for space. Right, so that is kind of the how lionfish could have a effect on the entire ecosystem, not just on the things that they eat. Right, so they could have an effect by affecting things throughout the whole food web. So there's a couple ways or there's three different ways that invasive species tend to be controlled, that we kind of manage them. There's what's known as biological control, manual control, and then chemical control. So biological control is when you put some living thing in that ecosystem to control the invasive species. In this, will sometimes make sense in practice, right? So for instance, if there's something that is in a new area and it's doing really well, if you take the predator of that thing and then put that predator in that new area, then it might be able to control it. But what happens more often than not is that this really backfires. Probably the best example of this backfiring is from a story from Hawaii. So in Hawaii, there's lots of invasive species, and probably one of the most damaging ones are rats, right? So rats are not native to Hawaii, but what rats do is they eat the birds on Hawaii, and there's been a lot of extinction of local birds in Hawaii due to rats and due to other things that are eating them there. And so a long time ago, maybe about 50 years ago or so, someone had this brilliant idea. They said, well, we've got these rats here and we don't want the rats to be here. So why don't we bring in something that will eat the rats? So what they did is they decided on mongooses. So they released mongooses into Hawaii thinking, okay, the mongoose are going to eat all the rats for us. It'll be great. But what they didn't think about is the fact that rats are active at night and mongoose are active during the day. So the mongoose and the rats never even see each other, and the mongoose don't eat the rats. And so what instead are the mongoose eating? They're eating those same birds that people were trying to save by releasing the mongooses. So it's actually even gotten worse because now there's not just rats eating the birds, there's also now mongoose eating the birds. Right? So biological control is a good idea in theory, but it pretty much never works out how you want it to do. Manual control includes just removing them one by one. Uh, so manual control is the dominant way that lionfish are controlled, right? So there's me, there's a lionfish I speared, and there's the fish tacos that I made out of that lionfish. And so this has actually been covered a lot in the news in the case of lionfish, right? So there was a news article released by National Public Radio a few years ago about divers in Bonaire, where I lived, why they're so eager to kill lionfish. And this is how I know that I've made it as a marine biologist. I was quoted in NPR. How exciting! They quoted me about hunting for lionfish. And about how, when you hunt for lionfish, you can control their numbers, which is a good thing for ecosystems. So that's manual control, going in and removing them one by one. Of course, it's very time consuming, but it doesn't then have the other negative effects that biological control does. And then finally, there's chemical control. So that's releasing some chemical compound into an area in order to kill that invasive species. So these can be, so sometimes these can work pretty well. So for instance, it's now been found that a good way to control invasive rats is to put out bait for them. So by putting out chemicals that will kill them. So that's a form of chemical control. But oftentimes, other things will eat baits such as that. So sometimes there can be a lot of collateral damage with chemical control. And so really the best way to control invaders is just to keep them from getting in the first place. Because once they're there, it tends to be very, very difficult to get rid of them. So like lionfish in the Atlantic, for instance, they're probably always going to be there. It's going to be very hard to completely remove them from the Atlantic. The same with zebra mussels. It's going to be very hard to completely ever get rid of them. Same with kudzu. A lot of these things, once they're there, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. Okay, I want to talk just really briefly about ecosystem ecology just for a minute, and then we'll be done. So ecosystems, as I was saying before, include the living and non-living things that are in an area. So what ecosystem ecologists tend to study is not only the living things that are in an area, but non-living things such as energy flowing through food webs. Right, so a lot of what ecosystem ecologists do is they study food webs and they look at the linkages between different things that are in that food web. And they often also study things like chemical cycling, right? So looking at how carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus, how those things flow through an ecosystem, right? We, for instance, have talked a little bit about the carbon cycle, right? We've talked about how there's carbon in the atmosphere, how plants take up that carbon and photosynthesize with it. Then animals come along and eat those plants, and other things eat those animals die, and then decomposers, take the dead bodies of those dead things, and they then eat them, and they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, starting the whole cycle again. So why we know about those cycles is because of the work of ecosystem ecologists. And like I was saying, food webs are a really important part of this, right? So putting together the various things that are in an ecosystem and looking at what eats what and seeing, how one thing might affect other things, right? And this is, in a way, kind of how we figure out, important interactions between, organisms that are in that ecosystem, right? So if you have urchins that are in an area, we know that urchins eat kelp and other algae. If there's too many urchins, we know that these kelp and other algae that they're going to go away. And we also then know from that the things that rely on those, things like these smaller herbivorous fishes and invertebrates, they're going to then have a hard time living if those kelp and other algae go away. Right? So by building a food web, then you can kind of see what's going to happen if abundances of these different things go up and down. Right? We can kind of make predictions about what would happen if, say, urchins became too abundant, or if lobsters and crabs became too abundant, or things like that. Okay, so that's all I've got to tell you about community ecology and ecosystem ecology.